Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 36. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 36, the top 3 issues are the text, grammar, and meaning of Psalm 36 2a, the syntax and meaning of verse 3, and the division of verse 8. The first of our top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 36 is the text, grammar, and meaning of Psalm 36 verse 2a, the first part of the verse. Following the opening superscription, the Hebrew text as we have it begins with the following words: Ne'um pesha larasha b'kerev libi. These opening words have a number of difficult technical issues and have therefore been interpreted many different ways. Consider the following translations. The ESV has, "Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart." The NIV has, "I have a message from God in my heart concerning the sinfulness of the wicked." Meanwhile, the NJB has, "Sin is the oracle of the wicked in the depths of his heart." Finally, another translation reads, "The wicked man's word of rebellion penetrates deep into my heart." And this is just a small selection. You can see our resource page on our website for an extensive list of different translations. Now, in order to make sense of this issue, we need to ask at least 3 important questions. First, who or what is the speaker? The word ne'um here refers to a declaration, an oracle, or a prophetic speech, but it's not clear who is speaking the oracle. Is it the oracle of rebellion or transgression personified, as for example in the ESV where transgression speaks? Or is it the wicked man's oracle, as in the last 2 translations here? Sin is the oracle of the wicked in the depths of his heart, and the wicked man's word of rebellion penetrates deep into my heart. The second question is about the word for heart at the end of the line. Whose heart is it? Is it my heart, as in the NIV, for example, or his heart, as for example in the ESV? Finally, what is the function of the prepositional phrase la rasha? Does it indicate the recipient of the oracle, as in the ESV, transgression speaks to the wicked, or the possessor of the oracle, as in the NJB, the oracle of the wicked deep in his heart, or something else? So let's begin with the first question. Who or what is the speaker? The first words here, as we have it in the Masoretic text, are ne'um pesha l'rasha. Now the first word, ne'um, as we said previously, refers to a declaration, an oracle, or a prophetic speech of some kind. In the Hebrew Bible, this word has an important function as a kind of prophetic formula, introducing a prophetic oracle, especially spoken by God through a prophet. Out of around 375 times that the word ne'um appears, 267 of them follow the formula ne'um Adonai, the declaration or oracle of the Lord. Take, for example, the opening of Psalm 110, Ne'um Adonai la'adoni. Ne'um Adonai, the declaration of the Lord, la'adoni, to my Lord. Or, as most translations have it, the Lord says to my Lord. The issue in Psalm 36 is that in this prophetic formula, the word ne'um always, without exception, introduces a person as the speaker. Whereas here in Psalm 36, it seems to introduce not exactly a person, but a common noun, pesha, rebellion, as the speaker of the ne'um, of the declaration. So this creates 2 options. Either pesha, rebellion, is the speaker, and we have a personification of this word as if rebellion was a kind of prophet making a declaration. Or pesha is not the speaker, and an alternative must be found. Our preference is to take the first option, along with, for example, the ESV. Transgression or rebellion speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. Or as the New Living Translation translates it, sin whispers to the wicked deep within their hearts. Although we don't have another direct parallel using this ne'um formula, we do have lots of parallels in the Hebrew Bible of words for sin being personified, of personification. For example, in Genesis 4:7, God tells Cain that sin, hatat, is crouching at your door like a lion ready to pounce. Or in Psalm 119, 133, let no iniquity, avin, get dominion over me. Or an especially interesting example is Job 15:5. Ya'alef avoncha ficha. Literally, your iniquity teaches your mouth. It is therefore natural to read ne'um pesha in Psalm 36 as also personifying sin, like these other cases, as if pesha was a deceptive prophet speaking to the wicked. One could also consider the parallels of Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly in Proverbs 8 and 9, where wisdom and folly are personified as women who call out to those who pass by on the street. Furthermore, this reading also has some support amongst ancient witnesses. Other than the Masoretic text, Aquila, Symmachus, and Quinta all have equivalent words to Pesha here. Athesia, Asunthesias, and Asebea, and the Secunda in Origen's Exapla also has Fesa here, which clearly is a transliteration of the word Pesha. In contrast, however, the Septuagint translates Pesha here as ho paranomos, the transgressor of the law. This probably reflects an alternative vocalization of this word from Pesha to Poshea, meaning one who rebels. This would make the speaker of the oracle the one who rebels. Although this is possible, and a number of other alternative possibilities are also, the most natural reading is to assume that Ne'um, as it always does, introduces the speaker of an oracle, only that here the speaker is not exactly a person, but it is Pesha, rebellion, personified. The common personification of sin words in the Hebrew Bible, along with ancient witnesses, show that this personification is certainly plausible. And, as we shall see, this reading also makes clear sense in the context of the verses that follow it. Altogether, then, these arguments show that Pesha, rebellion, provides the most natural answer to the question of who the speaker is. This is reflected in our translation, Rebellion's Declaration, or Rebellion's Declaration Speaks. With that, we come now to the second question. Whose heart is referred to here? The Masoretic text has here Ne'um Pesha la Rasha Bekerev Libi, finishing with the word libi, my heart, adding the first person suffix to the word lev, heart. However, the ancient witnesses differ on this, with many bearing witness here to the alternative libo, his heart, with a third person suffix his instead of the first person suffix my. Compare, for example, the ESV and the CSB translation. The ESV has, as we've read already, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. The CSB has an oracle within my heart concerning the transgression of the wicked person. This is a textual issue to do with the interchange between the letters Vav and Yud. It is important to note that this is not a surprising issue, as the letters Vav and Yud were graphically very similar and commonly interchanged or confused. With that in mind, let's consider the reading of Libo, his heart, first. To begin, the majority of ancient textual witnesses support this reading. It is in fact the Masoretic text that has the minority position when you consider all of the evidence. The Greek Septuagint, for example, has here heauto, using a third-person form corresponding to libo, his heart. The Latin Vulgate, the Syriac Peshitta, and a number of other ancient witnesses also have this third-person suffix here. Furthermore, reading libo here instead of libi fits the context of Psalm 36 in a number of very compelling ways. First, it would correspond neatly with a number of other third-person references in the following verses. Most notably, the very same verse beginning with Ne'um Pesha la Rasha Bekerev Libi, or Libo, continues with Ein Pahad Elohim leneged Einav. Einav. There is no fear of God before his eyes. Reading Libo would create a clear coherence referring to the wicked, his heart, his eyes in verse 2, along with his eyes and his iniquity in verse 3, his mouth in verse 4, and his bed in verse 5. In contrast to these many third-person references, his, nowhere in this whole section of verses 2 to 5 is there a single first-person reference, as we would have had with Libi. So this significantly tips the balance towards amending the Masoretic text here from Libi to Libo, Yud to Vav. However, a few points in support of the Libi reading require consideration. First, although the ancient textual witnesses are mostly in favor of the other reading, a very strong case is needed when seeking to amend the consonantal text of the Masoretic text. The fact that the Masoretic text clearly presents us with libi and not libo does make this the default reading unless sufficient evidence can be shown for an alternative. The striking carefulness in the handing down of the consonantal Masoretic text is well documented and clear. Furthermore, it's noteworthy that at least one other textual witness, namely the Targum of Psalms, does follow the Masoretic text here and has Levavi. Secondly, some have argued for the first-person interpretation here based on the principle in textual criticism that the most difficult reading is to be preferred. The fact that libi is not as coherent in this context as libo may have led scribes to switch to libo, his heart, as a way of smoothing out the coherence of the text. Although this argument is important, one must also acknowledge, of course, that in certain cases the less difficult reading is in fact the correct one and the more coherent one. Perhaps a more interesting argument seeks to show that in fact the first-person reading is in fact very coherent within the psalm. To begin, scholars have pointed out that although there are no other first-person references in these verses 2 to 5, there are in the psalm as a whole, and it's not a very long psalm. These come specifically at the end in verse 12. Do not let the foot of the arrogant come against me, and do not let the hand of the wicked drive me away. Not only would these create a correlation with the first person reference in verse 2, but the fact that these references would come at the beginning and end of the psalm also creates a poetic inclusio for the psalm as a whole, which we know is a common pattern. Furthermore, the libi could be rendered coherently in a number of ways within these verses. Take, for example, the NIV, which says, I have a message from God in my heart concerning the sinfulness of the wicked. So this reads, Ne'um pesha rasha, as a message from God, Ne'um, concerning the sinfulness, pesha, of the wicked, rasha. Then, Bekerev libi is, I have in my heart. Ne'um pesha rasha, Bekerev libi, then becomes, I have a message from God concerning the sinfulness of the wicked. Although such a reading is technically possible, it's certainly less straightforward than reading it as libo, as we explained above, especially in light of how naturally libo would fit coherently in the immediate context and all the mentions of his. However, to bring further clarity on this, we must add at this point the third question we began with, regarding the function of la rasha here. This prepositional phrase can have at least 4 different meanings, indicating either the recipient, the possessor, purpose, or the object. As recipient, the ne'um, the declaration of pesha, of rebellion, is given or spoken to the wicked person. He is the recipient of the declaration. This is the most common and straightforward meaning, following the default usage of the preposition lamed that we have here, indicating the direction towards the recipient of an action. It also fits perfectly with the prophetic formula of ne'um that we looked at it above, indicating specifically the recipient of the oracle. So this would be exactly parallel, for example, to Psalm 110, verse 1, which has ne'um Adonai la Adoni, the declaration of the Lord to my Lord. The majority of modern interpretations follow this reading. For example, ESV, which we've seen a number of times already, has transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. Or the NLT, sin whispers to the wicked, among many other examples. However, a number of alternative interpretations to la rasha have been proposed. The first is as possessor, where the lamed indicates here that the pesha, the rebellion, belongs to or is possessed by the wicked, as with the NIV. I have a message from God in my heart concerning the sinfulness, pesha, of the wicked, la rasha. Pesha la rasha, the sinfulness or the rebellion of the wicked. The second is as indicating purpose, where the lamed indicates the purpose of the ne'um, of the declaration. This seems to be the Septuagint's understanding, which has fesin ho paranomos tu hamartanen en heauto, which can be translated as, says the transgressor of the law in himself in order to sin, based on the infinitive form of tu hamartanen. These interpretations, along with a discussion of la rasha functioning as the object, another option, are presented in more detail on our resource page on our website. And although they may have some plausibility, the arguments above strongly point to the likelihood of the first option, namely that the lamed here follows common usage and indicates the recipient of the ne'um, of the declaration, in exact parallel, for example, to ne'um Adonai la Adoni in Psalm 110. With this, we have now answered the 3 questions raised above. For the question of who or what is the speaker, it seems most plausible that the speaker of the ne'um, of the declaration, is pesha, rebellion, personified. For the question of whose heart is it, at the end of the verse, seems most plausible to read it as libo, his heart, that is, the heart of the wicked. Finally, for the question concerning the function of la rasha, seems most plausible to read this as indicating the recipient of the ne'um, the one being spoken to. Putting all of this together, we have therefore translated this verse as rebellion's declaration speaks to the wicked in the midst of his heart. This would be similar to a number of modern translations that follow a similar reading. For example, the ESV, as we've read, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart, or the NEB, deep in his heart, sin whispers to the wicked man. For those interested, our resource page contains an extensive list of further translations. Now, if we were asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. Now, the second issue in Psalm 36 is the syntax and meaning of verse 3, and it is a continuation of the first issue. The Hebrew here reads as follows: Ki hehelik elav be'inav limtso avono lisno. Now this verse has proved itself extremely challenging to interpreters, such that one scholar has rightly said that the interpretation and classification of this difficult verse can only be done tentatively. We can therefore examine the options and arguments, but we must keep in mind that no clear and ultimately definitive conclusion can be reached. The challenges can be divided into two major issues: the subject of the word hehalik and the function of the final three words limtso avono lisno. Before diving into these two questions, a word about the context here. This verse is the continuation of verse 2, the verse right before it, which we've already discussed at length in the previous issue, leading to the translation of verse 2 as rebellion's declaration speaks to the wicked in the midst of his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. This opened the psalm introducing the declaration or prophetic oracle of Pesha, rebellion, personified, speaking to the wicked person in the midst of his heart. The result is then that the perception of the wicked becomes skewed, such that there is no fear of God before his eyes. The continuation of this picture of the skewed perception of the wicked comes then in verse 3 with these words, Ki hehalik elav be'inav. Let's take this one word at a time. The first word, ki, translated for or because, most likely introduces a reason, possibly the reason for why the wicked now has no fear of God before his eyes, the words right before. The word hehalik literally means to make something smooth, as in Isaiah 41 verse 7, where it refers to someone smoothing metal out with a hammer. However, here and in many other places, it has a more abstract meaning of to flatter or even to seduce. This is followed then by elav, meaning to him or to himself, and then be'inav, in his eyes. This then gives us something like for or because he has flattered him or himself in his eyes. Which brings us to the first question listed above. Who has flattered? Who is he? In other words, who or what is the subject of the verb hehalik? The two main options are the wicked person and rebellion personified. A third alternative would be to read the whole phrase limtso avono lisno as the subject here, but this position has very little support. For those interested, further details are available on our website. But let's explore these first two options. If the wicked person is the subject, then the idea is that he is flattering himself. This can be seen, for example, in the ESV, for he flatters himself in his own eyes. The subject of hehalik would then be provided by the last word of the previous verse. There is no fear of God before his eyes, that is, the eyes of the wicked person. For he, the wicked person, flatters himself in his own eyes. On a grammatical level, this is certainly possible, with gender and number agreement between the verb hehalik and the noun rasha, the wicked person. This would also fit in the context, as the next three verses are all about the wicked person and his skewed perception and self-deception. Furthermore, this would also be coherent with the next two words. The wicked man flatters himself, reading elav with a reflexive meaning and be'inav, in his own eyes. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, we have multiple examples using be'inav in a similar way, where the referent of be'inav is the same as the subject of the corresponding verb. See, for example, 2 Samuel 10 verse 12 and 2 Samuel 15:26. Altogether, these arguments show that reading the wicked person as the subject of hehalik here is certainly plausible, and this reading has been adopted by many modern translations. However, it may be even more plausible to read pesha, rebellion, as the subject of this verb. This would skip back to the word pesha at the beginning of verse 2 to find the referent for the subject of this verb. Rebellion's declaration speaks to the wicked in the midst of his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, the eyes of the wicked. Why? For rebellion has flattered him, the wicked, in his eyes. To begin, this is certainly plausible on a grammatical level, with gender and number agreement between the verb and subject. Furthermore, although pesha, providing the subject for this verb, is somewhat further than reading it as the wicked, who is referenced right before this verb with the words enav, his eyes, at the end of verse 2. Pesha is the nearest agent as the subject or speaker of the declaration, the ne'um, at the beginning of verse 2. However, the real argument for this interpretation is how it develops the opening presentation of rebellion personified, like a false prophet speaking deceitfully to the wicked. As one scholar put it, after this opening presentation in verse 2, one expects to hear further what and how transgression or rebellion, pesha, speaks to the wicked person. So this is reflected, for example, in the JPS translation, because its, rebellion's, speech is seductive to him, to the wicked. So coming back then to the question of who is the subject of hehalik, it is clear that it could be either the wicked or rebellion personified. Both positions are plausible, with rebellion personified being slightly favorable, although not by much. So that brings us to the second question regarding the function of the final three words limtso avono lisno. Grammatically, we have here the infinitive construct limtso, to find, then the noun avono, his iniquity, followed by another infinitive construct lisno, to hate. There are at least 5 different ways to understand the function of these words: as complements of the finite verb, as a purpose or result clause, as a negated purpose or result clause, as a temporal clause, or as indicating specification. As complements, take for example the NIV, which reads, "In their own eyes they flatter themselves too much to detect or hate their sin." The problem, however, with this interpretation is that the verb hehalik does not fit the category of finite verbs, which we would expect to take complements. So that brings us to the second option, purpose or result clause. Take, for example, the DRC translation. "For in his sight he hath done deceitfully, that his iniquity may be found unto hatred," or "in order that his iniquity may be found unto hatred." The problem here is that this does not really fit the context, as it turns this into a positive picture. His flattery actually helps him to recognize his iniquity and hate it. This does not fit the context of these verses, which show the skewed perception of the wicked. So the third option would then be as a negated purpose or result. This can be seen, for example, in the ESV, "For he flatters himself in his own eyes that, or in order that, his iniquity cannot be found out and hated." Or similar in the NRSV, "For they flatter themselves in their own eyes that their iniquity cannot be found out or hated." The problem with this is that no negator is present in the Hebrew, requiring an unusual addition here that, as one scholar said, precisely reverses the Hebrew rendering. The fourth option then is temporal, as with the JPS, because its speech is seductive to him till his iniquity be found out and he be hated. However, although the lamed can certainly have a temporal function, this would be very atypical usage of it. When indicating temporality, the lamed and infinitive construct construction typically occurs with verbs of movement and completion, along with the preposition ad, which is not the case here. Compare, for example, Judges 19:26, 2 Chronicles 29:29, or 1 Kings 18:29. So this brings us to the final fifth option of specification. Take, for example, the NASB. "For it flatters him in his own eyes concerning the discovery of his wrongful deeds" here. Or as one other translation puts it, "No, he is rather flattering himself in his eyes with regard to the finding out of his hateful guilt." Compared to other possibilities, this fits better on both a grammatical and a contextual level. The use of lamed to indicate specification, although less common, is well established in the Hebrew Bible. For example, in Genesis 17:20 we have "Ule Ishmael shma'aticha," and "as for, concerning, or with regard to Ishmael, I have heard you." Genesis 41:19 also shows this, with "Lo ra'iti chahenna b'chol eretz Mitzrayim la roa," such as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt with regard to or concerning ugliness. So the idea here would be that rebellion flatters the wicked in Psalm 36, or possibly the wicked flatters himself, with regards to finding his iniquity and hating it. The idea could be that rebellion flatters the wicked in his eyes, deceiving him into thinking that he has found his iniquity and hated it, when he hasn't actually, with the result that the wicked person no longer notices his sin, but is blind to it, because he thinks he's found it and hated it. So this could be similar to the NASB, for it flatters him in his own eyes concerning the discovery of his wrongful deeds here. This would be coherent with the effects of rebellion's deception of the wicked, leading to the continued sinful practices and skewed perception of the wicked in verses 4 and 5, where the words of his mouth are evil and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and to do good. He plots evil while on his bed. He remains beside every way that is not good. He does not refuse evil. This coherence in the context, along with grammatical plausibility, then makes the function of specification one of the more plausible interpretations of the function of the difficult words limtso avono lisno. However, as we acknowledged at the beginning, this verse can only be interpreted tentatively, and ultimately it is very difficult to determine with certainty its precise meaning. Based on considering all the possibilities, we then have chosen the personification of rebellion as the subject of helik, and the second line as functioning with specification. As such, we have chosen to translate this verse as, "For rebellion has flattered him in his eyes, that he has found his iniquity and hated it," or such that he thinks he has found his iniquity and hated it, when actually he hasn't. We would rate our confidence in this reading as a C. Now, the third issue in Psalm 36 is the division of verse 8 in a later section in the psalm. The Hebrew text of this verse reads as follows: "Mayakar hastecha Elohim uvane adam batzel knafecha yehesayun." The issue here centers on the word Elohim, which can mean either gods, lowercase g, or God, uppercase G, as in the one God, the Lord. Specifically, the syntax is ambiguous, and it is not clear whether this word Elohim should be grouped with the words before it or the words after it. If it is grouped with the words before it, then it would be a vocative addressing God, as in the ESV. How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. Most translations follow this interpretation. However, if it is grouped with the words after it, then it would have the meaning of gods, not God, and be part of a compound subject as seen in the NEB translation. How precious is thy unfailing love! Gods and men seek refuge in the shadow of thy wings. The important difference between these two possibilities is about who the subject then is in the second part. Is it just men, Bnei Adam, humans, who take refuge in the shadow of God's wings? Or is it gods and men who seek refuge in the shadow of his wings? This would be in the sense that divine beings, like those of the divine council and the angelic realm, also seek God's protection, as he cares for all the totality of his creatures. And this would create a significant difference in the picture depicted here. So let's start by looking at the arguments for and against the second possibility, reading Elohim as gods and grouping it with the words coming after it. The first argument is that the combination of gods and men as a compound subject was indeed a common phrase used in the Hebrew Bible and in the ancient world. For example, in Judges 9:9 and 13, we read about oil by which gods and men, or gods and mortals, Elohim v'anashim, are honored, and wine that cheers gods and mortals, again, Elohim v'anashim. Furthermore, not only was the wording of gods and men common, but the idea was as well. It was common to speak about the gods, the divine and angelic beings, in connection with men, seen for example in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, and the textual variations of that text. This famous verse says that when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, Bnei Adam, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God, Bnei Elohim, or Bnei Elim. Some understand this passage to indicate that angelic or divine beings were appointed in accordance with specific groups of humans. Now we also see this combination of gods and men, or divine beings and humans, throughout the ancient Near East, where divine beings and humans were often combined or grouped together. One really striking example, which would closely parallel Psalm 36, appears in Egyptian iconography, where the wings of the sun god Re appear over both divine and human figures, matching exactly the language of Psalm 36 about gods and men taking refuge in the shadow of God's wings. So reading Elohim here in Psalm 36 as part of a combined subject of gods and men is certainly plausible in light of historical ancient background and usage. But it can also be argued that this reading fits coherently in the context of Psalm 36 itself. First, it creates a merism, pair of contrasted terms that together create a sense of completion or totality. Thus, gods and men seeking refuge in the shadow of his wings implies that all God's creatures, gods, divine beings, and humans seek refuge. Interestingly, there is a high concentration of merisms in Psalm 36, as seen, for example, in words about the sky and the ocean deep in verses 6 and 7, as well as humans and animals in verse 7, among others. These surrounding merisms could then add support to the possibility of the merism of gods and men in verse 8. Second, if this reading is correct, then it would create a chiastic structure with the previous verse, where the combination of Adam uvehema, humans and animals, appears. The sequence of Adam, humans, behema, animals, Elohim, gods or divine beings, and Bnei Adam, people, could create an ABBA chiastic structure, which was very common in Hebrew poetry. However, despite these arguments, it is preferable to read Elohim as a vocative addressing God grouped with the words before it. First, this is how all ancient translations and witnesses have read this verse, whereas the other reading of divine beings has no ancient support at all. The Septuagint, for example, in its word choice and its syntax, clearly supports this reading. Hos eplethinas to eleosu ho theos, hoi de huioi ton anthropon en skepe ton pterugon su elpiusin. So here we see clearly the vocative ho theos, O God, separate from the sons of men, hoi de huioi ton anthropon. Furthermore, line division in all ancient manuscripts supports this reading, with Elohim being grouped with the words before it, as you can see, for example, here in the Aleppo Codex and Codex Sinaiticus. The Masoretic accentuation also follows this reading with a strong disjunctive accent, olevo yored, grouping Elohim with the preceding words as a vocative. The second reason supporting this reading is that of poetic line division. In the Psalms, poetic lines were almost always balanced or close to balanced, usually with 3 to 5 prosodic words per line. If Elohim here means gods or divine beings and is grouped with the words after it, it creates a heavy imbalance in the poetic division. The first line, Mayakar hasdecha, would have only 2 prosodic words, and the second line, Elohim uvnei adam b'tzel knafecha yehesayun, would have 6. This kind of 2-6 combination is almost never found in the Psalms, with most lines being 3 to 5, and very, very rarely 2 or 6. Meanwhile, grouping Elohim with the words before it as a vocative does create balanced poetic lines. It could either be Mayakar hasdecha Elohim, 3 words, then Uvnei adam b'tzel knafecha yehesayun, 5 words. Or it could be Mayakar hasdecha Elohim, 3 words, Uvnei adam, 2 words, b'tzel knafecha yehesayun, 3 words. 2 different ways of dividing it. Either way, a 3-5 pattern or a 3-2-3 pattern are both normal in the Psalms, whereas a 2-6 pattern would be extremely unusual. Finally, reading Elohim as a vocative here fits much more naturally in the context of Psalm 36. In verses 6 to 7, God has already been addressed twice using vocative forms. The second of those 2 vocatives at the end of verse 7, you deliver humans and animals, Lord, also appears at the end of the poetic line, just as this one would in verse 8. Of course, in verses 6 and 7, the divine name, the Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He, is used and not Elohim. But these are often interchanged, and God is also called Elohim in verse 2 of this psalm. So a vocative addressing God as Elohim is perfectly acceptable here. Altogether then, the unanimous testimony of ancient witnesses, the balance of poetic lines, and the context of Psalm 36 makes it quite clear that Elohim should be grouped with the words before it as a vocative addressing God. We have therefore translated this verse as, "How precious is your loyalty, God. Mortals, or men, or humans, take refuge within the protection of your wings." We would rate our confidence in this reading as an A rating. Now, the way that we resolve each of these 3 exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. So it is important to step back for a moment and see how each of these 3 issues affects the meaning of the entire psalm. With the first issue, our conclusion has significant impact on the opening picture of the psalm, and especially about determining the participants involved. Specifically, it shows that the psalm opens with a personification of rebellion, of Pesha itself, who makes a kind of prophetic or false prophetic declaration to the wicked as he speaks into his heart. This personification of rebellion sets the stage for the rest of the psalm as a whole. Meanwhile, the second issue shows the continuation of rebellion's influence on the wicked, developing the opening picture. Our tentative conclusion of this difficult verse points to the way that rebellion flatters the wicked, skewing his perception of himself, of God, and of his own sin, such that he thinks he's found his sin and hates it, but ultimately he is just deceiving himself. The third issue took us to a later section of the psalm, where now the focus has shifted from rebellion and the wicked to God and his abundant goodness and loyalty to his people. However, it wasn't clear if those receiving God's blessings are just humans and animals, or also included divine beings or gods. Our research showed that at least in this psalm, the divine beings are probably not in view, but the focus is primarily on humans. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 36, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the whole psalm and explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.